Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this video interview in the Indeed Knowledge series. Indeed is a collaborative project bringing together practitioners, researchers, and organizations across Europe working to advance the field of evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based policy and practice. I'm very glad to be joined here now by one of the leading researchers in this project, Stephan Klose. Stephan, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Kai, for having me.
Now, you've been working the last 2 years in this project, really diving into the field of evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based policy and practice. And one of the things that we've been discussing is that this concept of evidence-based has become a bit of a buzzword, not only in the field, but in many others internationally. Could you tell us a little bit about what you understand by it?
Yeah, so evidence-based practice is one of the much talked about buzzwords out there in the policy field, and as you rightly mentioned, across the board we've got evidence-based agriculture, evidence-based education, evidence-based policing, and especially in the Anglosphere, in the UK, in the United States and Canada, this is a really big topic. And perhaps because it's become so popular, it's also become increasingly difficult to define what evidence-based practice is. There are many definitions, different understandings out there, and also many misunderstandings about the term. So the most common definition, which I think is also the most useful one of evidence-based practice, is of evidence-based practice as a decision-making process, and a very specific kind of decision-making process which rests on three core elements. The first element, which is maybe the most obvious one, is a review of the evidence base, so a review of existing research. This is one element that we want to have in the decision-making process. A second element is professional judgment, professional expertise, and the third element is a genuine concern for the values, the circumstances, the preferences of the community or the individual, whoever is affected by the decision. So maybe to give you an example from medicine, if I go to the psychiatrist with symptoms of depression, and ideally the physician, the psychiatrist on the other side who I want to meet is first of all someone who is well aware of the current research on possible treatments of depression, so for instance antidepressants. Right, so we want someone who has good knowledge of the evidence out there, who's following this. But we also want someone who has clinical expertise. Right? We do not want to meet a researcher who sits at the desk, right, and who has great knowledge of research, but who doesn't know how to diagnose me correctly. Right? So we want a clinical expert who is good at recognizing symptoms and so on. And thirdly, what we want to see is someone, ideally, who takes me as a patient seriously, right? Who seriously considers my own personal circumstances, my health record perhaps, who also considers carefully what my own preferences are, my values are. Maybe I'm a patient who really does not want to take antidepressants, who wants to explore alternative types of therapies. And so that healthcare professional who we're imagining here, like someone who's well aware of the research evidence, someone who's a clinical expert, and someone who is very patient-oriented in their work, like this will probably describe the perfect practitioner of evidence-based medicine. And the idea is that this type of decision-making, which includes these three aspects, like that should be applied in other areas as well, be that education or policing or social work.
So those three core building blocks then: best available knowledge, best available evidence, professional judgment, professional experience, and engaging with the needs, the cultures, what is important to the stakeholders.
Yes, exactly.
So if that then is evidence-based, what is the relationship between evaluation and evidence-based?
Yes, that's a really good question. You can think about it in two ways, basically. And the more traditional way of thinking about this is of evaluation as an enabler of evidence-based practice. So if we have a lot of evaluations, the logic goes, we have a strong evidence base, and then we can draw on that evidence base to do evidence-based practice, right? So we need evaluation for evidence-based practice to be possible. But you can also think about it in another way, and this is how we think about it in our project, of applying the principles of evidence-based practice to the process of evaluation itself, right? So this is basically recognizing that the process of evaluation is also a decision-making process, right? So if we are consistent about the idea of evidence-based practice, then that idea should apply to evaluation as well.
So
right?
making the evaluation an evidence-based practice itself.
Yes, exactly. So this is how we've come to promote the idea of evidence-based evaluation.
So then what's the relationship between evaluation and evidence-based evaluation? How would you define evidence-based evaluation specifically? There is a lot of evaluation that's out there. Are all evaluations evidence-based?
Good question. So let's start with the definition. So evidence-based evaluation, if we use the definition we just apply to evidence-based practice, is also a decision-making process which has three key components. Right? Again, review of external evidence, professional judgment, and concern for those affected by those decisions. In the context of evaluation, that means we have to carefully think about what kind of research do we need for an evaluation to be successful, for an evaluation to be substantial, right? So we need to think about types of research we want to involve in the evaluation process. A second thing, we talked about the example from medicine, right? We want a medical professional with clinical expertise. If we apply that to the field of evaluation, then we also want an evaluator with expertise in the field, both with expertise, experience in evaluation, but also in the field where the evaluation takes place, right? So if we talk about PCVE, then ideally we want an evaluator who has knowledge in the field of preventing and countering violent extremism. And then thirdly, we talked again in the context of medicine about evidence-based practice as patient-oriented. Right? If we do translate that to the area of evaluation, then we want an evaluation process that is stakeholder-oriented, where the preferences, the circumstances, the values of stakeholders are really taken into account and are genuinely considered at every stage of the evaluation process. So those three things together, again, like same logic here that we applied elsewhere, should be applied to evaluation as well.
So you mentioned just a moment ago PCVE, so preventing and countering violent extremism, and that's really the focus of the Indeed project, looking at the application of evidence-based evaluation to this field, preventing and countering violent extremism and de-radicalization. Why is it so important that we have more evidence-based evaluation in this field?
Yeah. So first of all, it's generally important that we have more evaluation in this field. Right? There is a lack of evaluations in PCVE. We have more evaluations than we used to, so there's also progress, but generally we still lack evaluations, and in some countries there is a very serious gap. We do not really know very well how many of the measures that countries have taken over the past few years to prevent and counter radicalization work. We do not know whether they're effective, efficient, legitimate, appropriate. We do not know very much. So there's generally a need of evaluation. But there's also a need for good evaluations, for qualitatively good evaluations. And one way we can make evaluations better, this is the assumption of our project, and the assumption of evidence-based evaluation, is by using the evidence that we have, which luckily in the field of PCVE is increasing. We have more research these days on risk and protective factors. This is literature which is rapidly growing, so we do know more about the factors that matter for radicalization, also the factors that matter for preventing radicalization, and we should use that literature in our evaluations. And secondly, we also know more about different preventive measures. Again, we do not have very many evaluations, but evaluations are growing. There are more and more of them. So we do have a sense of which types of measures work, to some extent at least. And this is, again, another area of research which we should build into the evaluation process, which we should draw on in order to improve our evaluations. We should learn from what already exists.
And you've actually developed a tool to help evaluators and practitioners to be able to draw upon that. You've done work within this project on developing a repository of risk and protective factors as well.
Yes, exactly. So we have one repository, which is an online database, which is freely available to anyone. We can only recommend it, I guess, to all of our listeners.
Which is part of why we're trying to bring it out here as well.
Yeah. Very shameless self-promotion, but also an absolutely important tool, I think, for future evaluation. So what we have done is look at all the studies on risk and protective factors out there, of which there are many now. There used to be very few. In the 90s, we had about 5 good studies a year on risk and protective factors. That doubled perhaps in the 2000s. Now we're at a rate of creating around 30 really good studies every 6 months in the area of risk and protective factors. So that literature is rapidly growing, but there is a problem because that literature is hard to access, right? For any practitioner, but also for any researcher, really. First of all, these studies can be hard to find because they are scattered across different academic journals, scattered across different books, handbooks, edited books, whatnot, in the fields of psychology, social work, education, criminology, and so on. So it's difficult to understand what is going on in that discussion around protective factors and risk factors, and they often sit behind a paywall. Right? So they're very, very difficult to access, even for those people who find them. Right? So what we have done to improve access to these studies is to create a database where we collect all of these studies, where they can be found, and what we do there as well is summarize the key findings from each study. So even those studies that you cannot access because they sit behind a paywall, you at least will be able to read what the main findings are. And with those findings in mind, we can approach an evaluation and think about, for instance, a theory of change of a certain initiative and review its appropriateness. Right? So we can think about whether an initiative that tackles or that addresses, say, the parents, right, of at-risk adolescents, whether that's a good idea or not. So, for instance, if that's our initiative and we want to evaluate it, what we could do in a first cut is look at all the studies that exist out there on parenting as a risk factor, as a protective factor. That will give us a sense of whether parents are the right group to address in the first place. Right, so with that knowledge, we can create a baseline for our evaluation. It helps us interpret our findings. And sometimes we can even derive some good indicators from looking at the studies that are already out there.
And that is really an incredibly important and very significant step forward for the field. When you mentioned earlier best available evidence, part of what is necessary is to actually make that evidence available and in a way that practitioners, policymakers, and experts can engage with it. And that's what the Indeed repository really does. You cited a challenge there, the fact that sometimes evidence is there, but it's scattered in different areas or it's behind a paywall. What would you see as some of the other challenges for introducing the practice of evidence-based evaluation into the PCV field today?
Yeah, so unfortunately there are quite a few challenges out there to each of these different principles of evidence-based evaluation. So we have challenges to the availability of evidence. We just talked about a few of those. We could add that even though knowledge is increasing, it's still quite limited. So depending on the initiative that we want to evaluate, there may be relevant evidence out there, there may be not, right? So there are a lot of important gaps that need to be filled in the research literature as well, for which we again need evaluation. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation sometimes. So that's one thing. But there are also a number of significant hurdles when we look at the other two aspects, right? So when we look at stakeholder inclusion, for instance, and we want to promote this idea of a genuine concern for the stakeholder values, preferences, and circumstances. What we need in order to do that is time, for example, right? And often there is no time in an evaluation. The way many evaluations are planned is only leave space for a very rushed process, for a very rigid process. Maybe the evaluation design is already decided up front, and that leaves very little room for stakeholder involvement, for stakeholders to voice their concerns, for stakeholders to be part of this evaluation experience at all. Another problem is resources, right? If you want to include stakeholders, you need not only time, but you need maybe more people who work on the evaluation in order to speak to everyone, in order to have resources that allow you to gather all the relevant people, and so on and so on. So there are a number of problems there. And then finally, we also have to talk about expertise, right? There are many countries where we have a lack of expertise in the field of evaluation. And that too is an important hurdle, right? So we have to build up expertise as well. So if we think about ways to improve evidence-based evaluation, or making it happen, making it possible, we not only have to think about making research available or investing more in research. That's only one aspect, right? We also have to think about how can we include stakeholders in a thorough way, and how can we make sure that we have experienced, good evaluators with the right type of expertise.
So, looking at this, what do you see as some of the solutions for how we can advance this within the field? What are some of the innovations that you've been coming across in your work?
Yeah, so again, maybe looking at these three parts separately, when it comes to improving the situation around accessing research, accessing available evidence, we just mentioned one part of the solution, right, which is our repository. Yes, exactly. And we probably need more of those. That is just one literature that we summarize that way, and there are other important literatures out there that we should summarize in similar fashion, right? So it's good if we can quickly get to know more about risk and protective factors. We also need a repository which we will build in Indeed still, which looks at preventive measures and what we know about them. Like, what do current evaluations tell us about counter-narrative programs, for example? Do they work? If so, when? Under what circumstances? Which types of counter-narrative programs work? We do have more evidence there on those. We do have more studies coming out, and we need to summarize that kind of knowledge as well. Another type of knowledge which is really important is evaluation practices themselves. To my knowledge, at this point, we do not have a good repository which summarizes what we know about evaluation work, right? So there are many studies out there on how to include stakeholders, for instance. There are systematic reviews that tell us how to include stakeholders. But again, that kind of knowledge can be very difficult to find, and can be difficult to find quickly. And often in evaluations, we need it quickly, right? Again, the time constraints. So there is room for more of these databases, and ideally they should be integrated in such a way that they are accessible to people and people know of them. That's one part. Sorry for a long answer, but I'm going to go through the others quickly. Expertise. So we need to build expertise. One way we could perhaps do this is by more often bringing together evaluators from different countries. We have some countries which have a lot of evaluation expertise, which have been evaluating for already quite a few years in this area, in this field of PCVE. The UK, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries are certainly up there. And then there are other countries in other parts of Europe, perhaps in the south and east especially, which have less of that kind of expertise. So by bringing people together from different parts of Europe, we can help strengthen evaluation experiences and expertise across the board. So not every country has to go through its own
capacities for evaluation.
Yes, exactly. So that's maybe one way to address that problem. Another way to address it is through clever online tools, through webinars, through podcasts such as this one, which people can listen to from across the continent and beyond. So that's another way of strengthening that kind of expertise. And then when it comes to stakeholder inclusion, I think what we really need there is find ways of creating awareness for how important it is that evaluations are well planned, that they have enough time and resources, and which are essential in order to reach out to people in a sufficient way, and also to do the follow-up in a way that leads to learning effects in an organization. So for that, we need to think of evaluation with a very different time frame, and I hope that this project helps us a bit to promote that kind of understanding of evaluation.
So let's look at that shift in time frame, because one of the challenges which has come up, been identified within the project, we hear it time and again from evaluators, you mentioned it yourself now as well, time and resources. That evaluation is often done at the end of a project, sometimes it's done quite rushed. But if we go back to this example from medicine, part of what I find most inspiring and exciting about the medical field is they have built an approach to learning in the field. They've built an approach to identifying and understanding the importance of evidence and learning, but also then of how you transmit that in the field. So you have actual systems in place. You have medical conferences, you have medical seminars, you do case review after particular operations, and they built it into their way of work in the field. It's not seen as something that is separate from or an add-on, but it's part of the fundament of the practice of medicine. How would you see us going there in the field of PVE, CVE, and in strengthening evaluation practice in Europe? What do we need to do to build this into our way of work in the field?
Yeah, so I think we've made some advances in the field of PCVE, so this is quite encouraging. I think there is more awareness around evaluation. We do evaluate more than we used to. We have a better knowledge base than we used to, so that's all good. And this also creates experience, expertise. We have more people who have done an evaluation before in this field. So that is great, and there's certainly a lot of things that are going the right direction. We also have a number of available tools that help people evaluate. There are many organizations which are working on some, ours included. So we are creating some tools that hopefully will help in developing a better infrastructure around evaluation. So this is what indeed at its core it's all about. And I hope that this is work that will be continued, that organizations like the European Commission and others will continue to fund this type of work. Creating infrastructure, but also maintaining it, which is often a problem. So we have a lot of great tools, also online databases and so on out there. But what we often or sometimes lack is sustainability in them. So there have been many great initiatives which disintegrated once the funding for that particular project ran out. And I think what they have in medicine is, at this point at least, a much more institutionalized structure of organizing evidence-based practice. Evidence-based medicine is by no means without its own problems. So certainly there are many within medicine who are also calling for improvements. So you're never really done, right? But we can learn a lot from medicine, especially when it comes to, I think, quick communication between research and practice. I think this is an area where medicine has long been at the forefront. And there are a lot of systems, I think, that we should take a close look at and see whether we can learn from them. And in some ways, this has already happened, right? I mean, this is not something, would not be something new to do that. Think, for instance, about systematic reviews, right? So this is something that started in medicine. We've got the Cochrane reviews now, and now we've got the Campbell reviews, which is basically modeled on the medical field in criminology and more specifically in PCVE, right? So there are ways of drawing that kind of inspiration from medicine, and I think we should continue that.
Let's turn to that then. You spoke about the need for sustainability, for continuing with initiatives. A lot of progress has been made. The field is developing. We're having more evaluations done. Is there at this point yet the understanding amongst policymakers and at government and policy decision-making levels about the importance and the role of evidence-based evaluation in the field?
I think depending on the government, there is certainly a lot of interest in evaluation, in also investing in evaluation, but there are differences. There are differences between countries. We see some countries which are very eager to not only invest in evaluation, but also to think about how we can create better evaluations. If I, for instance, think about current German initiatives, there's quite a lot of work being done on evaluation in PCVE at the moment, and that's encouraging. There are other countries where we see less of those initiatives. At the European level, we have the European Commission being interested in evaluation, so that seems quite encouraging. There have been a few
EU knowledge hubs.
There's a new EU knowledge hub which is created, so that again could be one way to strengthen, especially evidence-based evaluation. Right? Again, evidence-based evaluation is all about access to knowledge, access to resources, and the knowledge hub could be that platform, right? That does give us the opportunity, maybe also to integrate some of the results from indeed like the repository that we discussed earlier.
Brilliant. Stephan, thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for the work that you have done in Indeed through these last years. Quite a step forward to help us in the field to really advance our understanding and our practice of evidence-based evaluation within preventing and countering violent extremism. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Kai. Great to be with you.